I was just this morning like looking at your memoir. Yeah, I think that's important. And really thinking about uh, lineage and influence and well, also the picking up and putting down of influence and boycotting. If you would talk a little into the foundational views or curiosities or major influences that started you on your path from your tumbleweed lineage to contemplative dance practice.
It's intriguing to me to reflect back on it because I didn't really get interested in the notion of lineage or influences until I came to Naropa, and two things that were so influential for me were the way the Buddhist path honored and named and made a pretty big deal out of appreciation for those who'd gone before and had traveled the path before. It was kind of an introduction to that whole idea that of ancestor appreciation, or of the only reason we were here today was because these folks were back there doing what they did. And one of the great Tibetan teachers in the lineage that I was getting deeper and deeper involved with came to Boulder, Colorado after I just arrived here. His Holiness the Karmapa, the 16th Karmapa, and my teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, had to train us on how to be honorific and respectful and appreciate him. And we were a bunch of, or I was, and some of us were, I won't say the royal we, but, we were free thinking, leftist, anti-government hippie, dropout, disappointed with, etc. And so having to lean into that kind of respectful Eastern style bowing and lowering your head it was a big deal. It was like, whoa, it was part of my recognition of what it was to get involved and be influenced by another lineage and another tradition. For myself as a Westerner, an American, Protestant religious background, et cetera. And so that training and that intellectual instruction really was imprinted very strongly. And that was like 1976, 1977. And it was right around the time when I was also beginning to develop the dance movement studies, create the curriculum. I was thinking a lot about what is it that young artists need to train in so that when they leave Naropa, they can continue to unfold and experience and be curious about the artistic practices that they learned here. How can they continue to evolve? So it kind of melded into this importance of history and context. So that was sort of the translation from lineage to academia, was through history and context. And then I began to think, oh, okay, so what was my story? And there wasn't a lot of, let's see, the ballet, my early training in ballet, there was some introduction to the history of ballet. I guess, yes, there was some. American modern dance is a kind of break from all of that. American modern dance was very self-actualized. And each of those great people, Martha Graham, Jose Limon, and of course the person who was my big influencer and major teacher, Merce Cunningham, they were independent. They were originators. They were making something new. They were doing it in a fresh way. They were not maintaining a tradition, and they were not particularly honoring where they came from. And then to go from that to Judson Dance Theater and Yvonne Rainer and that tribe, there was even less acknowledgement of influences and teachers and previous people who had shaped our journey. But on the other hand, it would start to creep in a little bit as we went along. We would acknowledge it, but it was not a major pulse at all in that group. So coming out here to Naropa and beginning to work with education and the next generation was really when I think I made that big switch, as I said, from what is it to really look at how we've been shaped and molded and who were the people who did it and how to have appreciation and honor for them.
And in that place of coming from new form in performance world, and then you creating curriculum and new form in academic world, would you speak a little bit about things that translated or things that had to be retranslated, and some of your ideas around how performance and practice are either same or different, or what supports are needed in the academic classroom or the field of performance?
Yeah, that's a very deep question, really. It sort of underlies the Naropa educational experience, Naropa being this small, alternative, Buddhist-inspired college in Boulder, Colorado, that names what it does as contemplative education. And all along in the beginning years of Naropa, the faculty would wrestle with, what does that mean? What does contemplative education mean? And it was an attempt to name that meditative training or mind training, which was often a clearer way to talk about it within an academic context, was very central to the Naropa, to what initiated Naropa, was that you could bring together Eastern practices and disciplines and approaches with Western educational values. And that was one of the early slogans that the founder, Trungpa Rinpoche, gave us, was let East meet West and the sparks fly. So he saw it as a sparky kind of connection, that East and West would come together, and it wouldn't be this smooth flowing stream. It would be sparky. Sparks would fly, and it would press against the values of education, Western education, the North Central Accreditation Society. I think of that because Naropa had to receive accreditation in order to receive student financial aid, government aid. And the North Central Association was very conservative, ostensibly, and Naropa was really a stretch. And then it took us 6 years or so to get ourselves lined up with the values of the North Central Association's view of what made a stable Western educational institution. And so there was that dynamic, and then there was the dynamic of bringing Eastern practices to the West, translating meditative structures, how long one meditated, what type of technique one used, who was the teacher, who was the student, what was that relationship like, what was the path, it was called the path, how was that laid out, there was a beginning, you started at the beginning, and then you went through, and then you came into another sort of more expansive view, all those questions, and that translation of something that was really culturally quite foreign from America in the early 70s. So Naropa started in 74, Trungpa Rinpoche came to this country, I think, in like 70. I mean, it was, I guess he was in Britain before that, maybe 69. I forget exactly the dates. But yeah, I think the translation process, of course, I was fascinated by the translation process because also what was happening is that the wisdom dharma, the teachings, the understanding of the nature of mind, of human psychology, of body mind, the confusion and difficulty and bewilderment and unhappiness that we experience in our unstable existence was being laid out, and it was being laid out through a person who was translating from Tibetan to English. And he was a complete wizard of translation from my perspective. I mean, many people feel that. But he had a real gift of not abandoning the heart of the matter in the Dharma teachings, the rigor of it, and the demand of it, and the fact that it wasn't going to be all so wonderful. It was a challenging journey to take. He was very authentic about that, but he also was able to come up with images and poetry and slogans, and he was an artist, you could say, and it was very influential. That was extremely influential, was his delivering of this enormous, over 2,500-year-old wisdom tradition into English. Yeah. That was a big deal for me.
Yeah.
Really, so it meant I was thinking and feeling and sensing how I used language in the classroom.
Yeah. I still am so inspired by the language that you have offered around the practices and the simple elegance of the forms that allow for such adaptability for different situations, where it's performance or classroom or even the processing of a group experience. I wonder if you, well, maybe talking about slogans like the ability, or maybe I'm speaking about my experience of slogans and the ability for something to be looked at again and again and around, that they inspire, and you can find new unfoldings in them. Something like kinesthetic delight, which you know, have an understanding of those two words, but when they're put together and then in contexts, different contexts, how they breathe and allow for such infinite application.
That's a great example of the mixture of my lineage. Is actually kinesthetic. It comes from the movement studies traditions. It means consciousness of movement, really. It's about, awareness of movement, whether it's happening on the inside of the body as you breathe, or your heart beats, or you're digesting, or you're stretching muscles, or, sensing, feeling, as Bonnie Cohen describes it. That's kinesthesia. And so it comes out of that fascinating tradition, which was also a tremendous influence for me, where was the movement studies practices and the different approaches to body and body-mind awareness that were coming into New York Western culture at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s really impacted me a lot. But kinesthesia comes from that, and delight was something that was a word that Trungpa Rinpoche would use now and then. One of the slogans of Naropa in those early days from him was discipline with delight. And it was such a provocative slogan because we, as our, 60s hippie, freedom for all, do anything you want, all the breaking out of constraint that happened in that time, the word discipline was often met on the inner level with a kind of grimace. Like we kind of, I'll not say we, I kind of would clench a little bit. I'd had a lot of discipline in my life. I'd been educated in college, and ballet is a heavily disciplined modern dance, Cunningham technique, heavy discipline training, very monastic in many ways. And I was completely liberated by opening up discipline and becoming more improvisational. Uh-huh. So the phrase discipline, kinesthetic delight came in a teaching context. Again, it was the power in the classroom to kind of pull up these approaches that would allow students to have both guidance and also support for their own research. This was always this tension in the classroom for me, how to give guidance and how to create space for personal research.
Yeah.
Name those two, how to name those things. So kinesthetic delight is a guidance for personal movement research.
And where is there anything that you would tease out from a separation of practice and performance? This is always this curiosity that comes up, especially when I am speaking with theater artists about this translation.
Yeah, frankly, I became less and less interested in performance, personally. The classroom that I was able to have here at Naropa all those years was the most dynamic and satisfying exchange of artistic experience that I could imagine. I just had terrific groups of people who would show up, and we would go on this journey together, and I would be supporting them in an expressive outcome that they would, and they were interested in being expressive and in sharing that expression with others, performance. And so I became more interested in how to set up a environment where there was healthy feedback, where there were works in progress showings, where there was less competition and more excitement about the unfolding or the reveal as a project matured or developed or came into fruition. But I myself, I just wasn't really able to make that switch. I found making performances myself ultimately frustrating because I had to both be in them mostly and be the director, and I never figured that out. I just didn't figure out how to do it. I probably should have stopped performing with groups. Anyway, it wasn't so interesting to me, performance, as shaping these journeys for students, and finding ways to share this material and mix it together with the contemplative environment, the inner world. I just, that really satisfied me.
And in my experience with you at Naropa, in the MFA, that then being able for me to take that idea of art in everyday life and just my curiosity, like how to cultivate that curiosity of how it is to be, whether that being is in a theater performance or a dance performance. I mean, those continuous translations, or making a cup of tea, the attending perception, the attending bringing whole to that. And so I guess, I was going to ask you about inner, outer, and secret, which I think is like a continuation of that. If you want to speak about that. And then also, you have offered these practices to be adaptable, and that they're offered to change and evolve to meet whatever situations. And I wonder what curiosities or excitement you have about what is going on in the world and fields. And you've spoken about some practice groups.
I'm very aware of the contemplative dance practice as having developed a kind of it's unique of all the forms that I kind of originated at Naropa. It's unique in that it's a kind of self-contained practice environment. It's a body-mind practice. It's very, very much shows the coming together of sitting practice of meditation with movement research movement studies practice, and then the kind of open field of improvisation, movement improvisation, which becomes responsive, about being responsive to the space and the atmosphere in the space and the people who are there and what they offer you and how you respond. It becomes a kind of training ground for meeting the moment, which is again a kind of meditative instruction. How do we meet the moment? I mean, these things have infiltrated now into a lot of discussion about creative process. So I would say my focus shifted from creating performance to creative process. So it was process. It was about originating material because of where you are, the time of day, and the people that you're meeting. That instruction comes from the really ancient teachings of Buddha Dharma. So I think it's attributed perhaps to Gautama, Siddhartha. What time of day, what is the place, what is the subject, who are the students, and who is the teacher. Those are the 5 elements that set up an educational exchange. So I was always looking for these paradigms or instructions that came out of this old lineage. And that one fascinated me. I think contemplative dance practice has gone worldwide now. People have found it to be accessible with many different communities. It's been adapted. It began as a 3-hour practice. I mean, oh my God, that is so outrageous before we went into quarantine, of course. Everybody has 3 hours. But, there was a group who made a 1-hour practice, 2020 it was called. And I was originally, back in the 80s, when I heard about that, I was kind of like, oh, wait a minute. It's like that tension between tradition and thoroughness. It's like the tug and pull between tradition and adapting. So I would often feel that tug and pull. This came out of a tradition, and I adapted it, and now you're adapting it even more. Oh my gosh! I'd feel how far away things might have gotten, and would the outer, inner, and secret be lost? And it was good for me. It was good practice for me to begin to stay in touch with people and figure out how they felt comfortable calling me or asking me questions or what about this? And then I began to see that it was fine. It was just fine. People were enjoying being with each other. The simplicity of that structure just worked in all kinds of places all over the world. And it was great.
Yay. And we are grateful. Yeah. And to be able to have this common vocabulary or common feeling into the field, to travel around the world and meet others. What a gift of culture. So thank you. Barbara, Dilley, is there anything else that you want to talk about or point to, especially in this time of social distancing? Or
Yes. Well, I just wish that all of us can find unique and original ways to sustain our body, mind, and our creative curiosity. I think it's enormously challenging for the arts, particularly the social arts that require other to grow and exchange and become, something to share the stories of what it is to be human. I think it's really, really challenging. I feel I feel the grief in the art community right now. You know, everybody's struggling to use this new format to sing together and play symphonies together and make theater together and dance together. And I think we're being really called to evolve fast and deep. And I just wish that everybody gets as much support and help as they can to keep at it and it's going to change. It's never going to be quite the same. So all this history and everything is going to really fall into the history bucket.
The history bucket.
And all these things are going to have to be adapted it's a deep, rich, and there will be loss. And I wish for everyone good health.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Damaris.